Welcome to the Fut-Afrique channel, where every single week we get an opportunity to break down the important games in the world of rugby. The 2023 Rugby World Cup is officially upon us. We saw the first few matches being played, some big surprises specifically in that opening game, and of course the Peppermint Springboks did what they had to do. Predictions last weekend, of course, went the way of the Springboks, and that's exactly what happened this past weekend. Now, today, I'm not alone. I'm joined by a rugby expert, a man who absolutely loves his rugby. His name is David Midgley. David, how are you doing?
Yeah, absolutely thrilled with the Springboks victory and happy to be with you.
Definitely. I have to start the conversation here. Where were you watching the game?
From home. It's always the best place to
With a lack of braai, something in the hand, a cold one
You know
maybe?
you've got to. It's the national pastime is Springboks and braai time. They go hand in hand.
Definitely. We have to talk about the opening game. What an absolutely big surprise, at least from my perspective. I thought after the Springboks absolutely destroyed the All Blacks, they'll have something to prove, especially because they were playing the home nation. And France completely wrote a different script.
Yeah, the All Blacks with France was something that nobody really expected to be that one-sided really of a contest. I think the French in front of their home fans at the Stade de France, the spiritual home of French rugby, they really decided that today was the day that they were going to set their mark out ahead of the rest of Rugby World Cup.
Definitely. Let's talk about that All Black side. Over the last few years, they haven't been the mighty All Blacks as we've known them to be. We've seen Ireland beating them as well. Now it's almost as though there's a lot wrong with the All Blacks. What went wrong with the All Blacks? And is it just a case that Ian Foster has to completely change that team and change the philosophy?
I think if you look at the victories that the All Blacks have had in this World Cup cycle, you'll see that there have been victories that have kind of papered over the cracks that have befallen the All Blacks, and I think that's what's kept Ian Foster in the job for as long as he has. I think also not having your captain Sam Cane in that game has a massive impact. They've now since called up a replacement for him, but we know the absence of Siya Kolisi was a massive impact to us in terms of leadership and kind of going out there and leading by example. With Sam Cane not being in, it's always a challenge when that crucial man for your team is not able to fulfill that role for you.
Big question, looking at what we've seen thus far from the All Blacks, specifically against France. Do you think this World Cup is a done deal for the All Blacks? They will not win this World Cup?
I don't think you can ever write off a side like the All Blacks. The quality, their ability to perform at World Cups is certainly something that they will be cognizant of. I do think, though, they're going to have a challenge to get out of the group. I mean, if you look at that group now, Italy is on top with the bonus point. And so that game against Italy is going to be a crucial one. I don't want to be Namibia, though, because a twice wounded All Black side will be looking to maybe put up a century against that Namibian side. So some South Africans in that coaching setup, and maybe there's some information being shared with South Africa and Namibia ahead of that game. But it's going to be a cracker game.
Let's talk about France. We have to shine a massive spotlight on that French team. How phenomenal were they in terms of just containing the All Blacks and inserting their dominance upon the All Blacks?
I think they got a bit of a shock when the All Blacks opened the scoring. I think when you don't have somebody like Ntamak in your side who was ruled out before the World Cup, the fly half ahead of that first game, it can certainly rustle your plans that you have set up ahead of that first game. But boy, oh boy, did they come to fight. It's almost a pugnacious France for you. They're looking for that fight against the All Blacks, and they know that if they can turn the screw like South Africa did, they could come out with the victory. So magic from them, and Antoine Dupont is just magic. You just want to watch it. Just for the sake of Antoine Dupont, he just sets the world alight with his ability to read the game better than most others.
Big prediction. France, could they win the Rugby World Cup? Given the form that we are seeing at the moment, would you put your money on that France team?
I don't know. You remember that it's only England that have won the World Cup from the Northern Hemisphere. South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand having won the others. So you never know. But if there was ever a time to do it with the French side that they have at home, well, this could be their year.
Let's talk about the defending champions, the mighty Springboks, or some would call them the Peppermint Springboks. A lot of us were surprised with the fact that they weren't donning the green and gold. They were wearing peppermint colors. Were you happy with that?
You know what? It's something that we first saw in that game against Argentina, the second game against Argentina, the first World Cup warm-up game, where World Rugby is trying to accommodate those who are colorblind to have contrasting colors, both dark and light, so that you're able to track the game a little bit more. We have won twice with that color, so maybe it's something that we should look long term. But I know there's so much passion around the green and gold, and we will see them playing against Romania in that traditional green and gold, as well as Tonga, but not against the Irish side. So hopefully we can continue that winning run in the lighter blue color.
Colours.
Yes.
Let's talk about the game itself. I thought, at least in the beginning of the game, Scotland surprised us a little bit. You know, we saw the boys getting a little bit physical. Damien de Lindy getting in there, getting in their faces. Eben Etzebeth, we know how physical he likes getting, especially when there's a little bit of a brawl going on. To me, I was surprised with how strong they were in that first half. Your analysis of the first half versus the second half.
It was a real arm wrestle in that first half. I think we expected to come out and dominate at set piece. We didn't necessarily do that at scrum time. Frans Malherbe particularly struggling with a couple of penalties, and right before the halftime whistle, we saw that penalty that really put the Springboks on the back foot. I think Scotland tried a couple of new varieties with their lineup, not really going to their jumpers. There was a couple of instances where they went over the top, but execution wasn't there for them. South Africa in that first half really had met their match, but it's all about how you manage the game as a whole and not just kind of divide the two and see how you're going to respond to the challenge set out by the Scots.
Definitely. Game management, a big part of the game. Let's talk about the three players that were making their debut at the Rugby World Cup, specifically in the starting 15. A man who was donning the number 10 jersey, Manie Lebok. What an absolutely phenomenal performance from him. Man of the match. Kurtley Arendse is another part of the conversation, as well as Jasper Wiese. What did you make from these three guys in that starting 15?
I mean, Manie Lebok, we've seen his performances at URC. We know that his quality is there. And Jacques Nienaber has obviously been questioned quite a lot about his goal kicking, and again it came up and Siya Kolisi defended him. But I think for me, Manie Lebok is something that we need to nurture a lot more.
Yes.
You want to bring in Kurtley Arendse, that no-look kick, cross kick to Kurtley Arendse.
That was phenomenal.
That is something that will be memed for years to come.
Yes.
And it's a way in which South African fans to say, it doesn't matter if he's not kicking for poles. If he's creating tries like that, then by all means. Kurtley Arendse for me is somebody who's come into that Springbok side and just made a position his own.
Yes.
We look back at 2019, Makazole Mapimpi, Cheslin Colby on the right. It was a foregone conclusion. And yet Kurtley Arendse has come in and shook things up and put the other outside backs on notice to say, there's no way you're guaranteed to be in this position. I'm going to come in and make it my own. Beware of South Africans with scrum caps on, because they are something to behold. And then the thing I want to point out with Jasper Wiese is that most people would have thought maybe Dwayne Vermeulen is going to start because of his experience. Jasper Wiese was the one who caused the turnover that got Manie Lebok the ball to get Kurtley Arendse to score. So often people will look at Manie Lebok's kick, and fantastic and rightfully so, the same with Kurtley Arendse's ability to finish. But it was that breakdown turnover that was forced by Jasper Wiese that allowed the Springboks to turn over the ball and get onto the front foot.
Definitely. Let's talk a little bit about the bigger picture in terms of the group. Now, South Africa have beaten Scotland. In terms of the other games, I would say it's a foregone conclusion. Just Ireland will be a big talking point, but also that will determine who we play in the quarterfinals.
Yeah.
Where would you like to see South Africa? At the top of the group, or just second on the group? Because that determines who we play in the quarterfinal. And also, who would you like to see us playing?
So it's always fun to see who you would kind of pit yourself against, because you want to play the strongest opposition so that you're building up nicely to the final. You also, as a South African fan with your heart, would say, I don't want to actually have the most difficult transition through to the knockout phases. But South Africa have kind of allowed themselves to build up nicely. We had a good game against the All Blacks, and then we had Scotland. Ireland, in the contrast, had Samoa, which they were pushed by Samoa, and then had Romania to begin. So the journey for them is a lot more challenging than I think the Springboks in terms of getting that right against the big teams. Because remember, Ireland still have to play South Africa and Scotland on the back end of their group stages, whereas South Africa have Romania next, then we play Ireland, and then if we need to, we can bring it back against Tonga. So there's certainly an opportunity for the Springboks to redeem themselves and push ahead of that quarterfinal setup. you guys spoke about it on the last episode with who would you like to face. I think as a South African, my heart says the All Blacks, but my head says France. And why I say that is because the All Blacks, we've defeated them once. It's kind of the old foe, you know what you're going to get for them. And how they respond is going to be interesting. But to play the French in front of their home crowd in a knockout game, you never know.
It will be tough. I would like to shine a spotlight on the fact that South Africa weren't the perfect team. You know, even though we as South Africans, we were happy with the victory, there were certain areas where they had to be better. Looking at the next game that lies ahead for us, Romania, one would say that it's easy money. If you're a betting man, just put your money on South Africa. It's a done deal. What are the tweaks that we have to make heading into that game? Or could we possibly see classic Rassie Erasmus almost putting on a B team? Because that's something that he likes to do as well, just to give some other players some game time.
Yeah, if you remember the game against Namibia in 2019, Skalk Brits actually started that game at hooker. And so maybe it's an opportunity for somebody like Dion Fourie to get into that mix. Remember, Romania scored first against Ireland. So I don't think you can take any side for granted as to how they are going to perform on the day. Any side could come in and say, you know what, today's my day, and I'm looking for an upset. So it's a way in which both sides can kind of tweak some small issues that they may have had. Ibn Etzebeth out for the Springboks with a shoulder injury for about 10 days. So it's an opportunity for maybe, a John Klein, who is now fit, and then maybe partnering with Erge Sneeuw to see how we can tweak things. Maybe a return of Andre Esterhuizen and Kenan Moody.
All right. Let's look at another game that I would say is an interesting one, at least for the second round. That will be Australia taking on Fiji, just after the Springboks have played Romania. Where do you think this game will go? Because to me, Fiji seems to be a little bit of an interesting package at this World Cup.
Yeah, it was a surprise that they beat England at the home of English rugby. I think a lot of fans were kind of secretly rooting for the Flying Fijians in that Wales game. A little bit of refereeing inconsistency didn't help them, but be certain that they will come into this game against Australia fired up. Australia had their first game against Georgia. Eddie Jones noting the difference in physicality, that they weren't expecting the Georgians to kind of collapse under the pressure that they did. But Eddie Jones is Eddie Jones, and World Cups and Eddie Jones are a great pairing. So you never know what Eddie Jones, what cards he may have. We talk about Rassie Erasmus being a master tactician, but don't underestimate Eddie Jones. He's got a young Australian side. He's chucked out two of his senior players in Michael Hooper and Quade Cooper. So never underestimate his ability to pull out something spectacular in that game. And it's a game that both sides will know they need to win to progress to the next round.
I want to talk about Eddie Jones. When he took over the Australian team after he had a touch and go run with the England team, a lot of us were doubting him. We weren't really sure what he was going to actually bring. We saw them play the Springboks at Loftus, and that team was shaky to say the least. But he seems to be doing something right. What makes Eddie Jones so incredibly special as a coach? Because we know what he did in 2007, working with Jake White to win the Rugby World Cup for South Africa. So he's special, but sometimes we tend to question him.
I think his emotion is what kind of excites players, because he really has passion for those who he coaches. He really backs them. If you remember at Brighton in 2015, where the Springboks lost that game against Japan, kind of against the head, we really thought this is going to be a foregone conclusion, and Eddie Jones pulled a rabbit out of the hat. I think for Eddie Jones, he's somebody that is always thinking about how he can shift the thinking within his players. He's always asking them to think outside of the box. And I think that's possibly why he's left out those two senior men, is because he knows that if he's going to achieve something that's never been achieved with such a young side, I think he knows he's going to have to play outside of the box, color outside the lines, so to speak.
Big predictions in terms of the scorelines that we'll see this weekend. Let's start off with that Springbok game, Springbok versus Romania. What is your score prediction?
Well, it was 82 points to 8 against Ireland, and I don't know what the South Africans will be planning. I think they'll be looking to be a little bit more structured in their play to kind of settle down early, unlike what they did against the Scots. I do think that there's 50 points on offer for the Springboks at a minimum. Now, in times gone by, when we played Namibia, we gave them 100. Now, I don't think it's going to be that aggressive, but Romania have only won 4 out of their last 5 games. The Springboks are on a 5-match winning streak. So I think that momentum certainly lights the fire under the Springboks to really put on a show and get their points difference up as well. Because if it comes down to that at the back end of the group stages, they're going to find themselves perhaps a little bit short if they don't really put the Romanians to the sword.
Fully agree. That Australia versus Fiji game, how much money are you putting in that pot, right?
Yeah.
And in terms of the score prediction, how much would you say it would go to either or?
Yeah, I think if you're a betting man, maybe a 500 would kind of be your limit, and just to kind of put yourself 500, yes. And I think you could feel confident putting money either side. But I do as a neutral rugby fan want Fiji to win. We always want the kind of lower tier nations to really push the status quo within rugby. Fiji are within the top 10, and there's certainly a reason why they've got to where they are. I think they have gone into each of these games in the warm-up and the first one against Wales, leaving everything out on the park. I think it's a team that you don't ask the question of, do they have more? Is there more in the tank? Because they just lay it out there. I think it's certainly one that if you're a neutral, you'd want Fiji to win. But Australia, with their physicality, we saw the way in which they approached the game against Georgia, really putting the Georgians under pressure at scrum time. It's where sometimes that we felt Fiji have kind of found themselves short. But their involvement in Super Rugby this year has certainly shifted their ability to compete with the top teams.
Definitely. David, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for your score predictions as well. But most importantly, I would like to hear from you. Who do you believe will win the next few round of matches? Yes, there are a few matches that are foregone conclusions. You don't have to worry too much about them. Of course, we'll be watching the Springboks, hopefully not the Peppermint Springboks this time, and as well as Australia that will be taking on Fiji. Make sure that you comment down below, and also remember to like and to subscribe the Fut-Afrique channel.